right, class, we're going to start some traditional watercolor techniques. First, we're going to just label the top of our watercolor paper. All right, we're going to be doing 9 different traditional watercolor techniques. These are not the only 9 traditional techniques, but these are very common and can be used in lots of different ways and combined together to create other techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and divide the paper up into 9 sections. Let's see if I can get this up a little bit. All right. So I'm going to divide this into 3 sections here. And divide it. That way I have space for all 9 in there. All right, we're going to start with number 1, and that's going to be a flat wash. And then number 2 is going to be a graduated wash. And number 3 is going to be wet in wet. Or it's called wet on wet, both are right. Number 4, wet and dry. Number 5 is glazing. Number 6 is a variegated wash. And number 7 is lifting. Number 8 is negative painting. And number 9 is dry brush. All right, you want to put your name somewhere. You could put your name on the back or on the bottom. That way you can turn it into me, because everybody's will look alike. And you can put your class period and right here as well. So we'll pretend I'm in first period. That way when they're on the drying rack, you can find yours fast by finding your name, because they might all look alike. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start these techniques, starting with the flat wash. So the materials you're going to need for this is a mixing tray, your watercolors, a water basin, and a paintbrush. I'm going to be using a number 8 today. You also will be needing a paper towel of some sort or rag to dry your brush off and do the lifting technique when we get to that one. All right, let's go ahead and get started. A flat wash is when you want just a nice, even color. So I'm going to start the flat wash off by taking whatever color I want to use. And I think I'm going to for the flat wash, use red. So you don't ever want to be painting from your watercolor palette. I'm referring to this when I say watercolor palette because you never know what color you're going to get. So you want to make sure you mix the color into your mixing tray so that it's all a uniform color. All right, so I'm just going to make a little square in here for the flat wash. Okay, I'm going to start off by just taking I'm going to be taking and charging a bunch of watercolor into this dry brush, and this is a wet on dry technique, and you can see there's a little beaded color. I just kind of push that beaded color down and travel with it so it's not sitting and puddling anywhere. Now with watercolor, depending on how much water you use, that will depend on how intense the color is. So the goal for the flat wash is to have it solid so it doesn't have any dark or light colors in it like a value scale would have. It can take a little bit of practice, but when you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. You would use a flat wash in lots of different areas in a watercolor painting. A lot of people use it when they're doing glazes and building up values. Sometimes you just want a flat wash somewhere. So next we're going to be doing a graduate wash, and the graduate wash is the one that goes light to dark. This one is a little harder, so I'm going to make my square again in here. It doesn't have to be a square, it could be a circle or a different shape. So I'm going to try a different color for this one. I'm going to go with a kind of a cyan blue here. A little tip, when I'm painting, sometimes it's hard to tell the hue of the color. I will have a little paper and paint on it. And also keep in mind, because kind of when it's wet, it's hard to see. And also keep in mind, watercolor dries a shade lighter when it's dry. So you always want it a little darker than what you actually think you want it. So for the graduate wash, I'm going to load my brush up. I'm going to start on the top. Now this does work better if you have some pigment in there to start off with. I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to wash it in the basin, get all the paint off of it, and then I'm just going to take some water. So now it just has water in it, and I'm just going to bring it with water down here. Now, depending on your paper, sometimes that pigment likes to soak in. So I'm just going to go back and forth here so it's nice and even. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my brush, wash it off, charge it up with some more water, and just come in here with the water. I'm just going to go back and forth on that line, smooth things out. Now you have to be careful, because if I were to go back with the dry brush on the top, it'll actually lift it off. And this also will take some practice as well to get a nice even value. And depending on the type of watercolor and paper you have, it could be a little tricky too. But it's going to go light to dark. I'm just going to go back over it one more time just to kind of bring some of this color down. Now, if you mess up on this, no big deal. You can always try it again on the bottom of the paper to practice again. All right, the next one we're going to be doing is wet and wet, my favorite technique. So we're going to do this two different ways. So I'm going to mark this down the middle, okay? So wet and wet is a really nice technique for backgrounds. One thing I forgot to tell you about the graduate wash is really good if you're trying to make something with value, or they're really good for skies, lots of things. But it will create a sense of value, light to dark. So with the wet on wet, the first one we're going to be doing is we're just going to be wetting the area with water. And then for this one, if you want to be a little daring, you can take paint straight from your palette instead of your mixing tray. If you don't care about being predictable, and you can just see it, just tap it in there. And you can see the water really moves the paint around and travels. Now, like I said, it's unpredictable. You really don't know what's going to happen, so you can't do something like with this technique where you need hard edges or anything like that. The water's just going to take it where it's going to take it. The next wet on wet technique is where instead of wetting the surface with water, I'm going to be wetting it with a color instead. Now, there's no right or wrong, but I like to go light to dark. So I'm going to wet this with, oh, I've got lots of pigment on there. I'm going to wet this with the watercolor instead of just plain water. Oops, I already got in that one. You can see what's happening. And then take my color and mix it right into that color. So there you go. When you mix watercolor together on the paper, it's called charging. So here was watercolor in there and then a color with water in there. Still, both of them are wet on wet techniques, and they both work really well depending on what you're going for. All right, the next one we're going to be doing is the wet on dry technique. I'm going to move my watercolors over here. So for the wet on dry technique, this is like your detail technique. This is what you're going to use when you want those hard edges and you want more control. Again, I'm not going to paint from my palette. I'm going to be painting from my mixing tray so I can see exactly what color I want to choose. So I'm just going to take my color that So wet on dry, let's just try a couple techniques. It's good for patterns, detailing, but as you can see, the edges are very hard. They're not soft and fuzzy. So when you're doing the wet on dry technique, you want to make sure that everything underneath it is how you want it, because if you go back over it with water, it will lose that hard edge. So typically with watercolor, all your detail work is last. So, wet on dry. Sounds pretty simple, but something to know. If you want those hard edges, got to paint on the dry paper, or else you're going to get soft lines. So sometimes you have to utilize a blow dryer in between your layers if you want the paper to be dry. And just like the wet on wet technique, you could do one layer over the other, dry on dry. Which is we're gonna come to next is the glazing. Okay, so with glazing, it is a wet on dry technique, but we're gonna make sure our colors are very watered down and have that translucent quality so we can layer them. So watercolor is a translucent medium, meaning that you can see through it. So if you're painting and your watercolors are super opaque, and you're not using a lot of water, that's probably not a good thing. It's better to layer unless you have a high intensity watercolor and it just happens to go on that way, because watercolor is supposed to be translucent. Now there is something called gouache. It's opaque watercolor, so if opaque watercolor is your thing, you might want to use a gouache. All right, so for the glazing technique, this is going to be our end result. You can see for glazing, we have to wait for one layer to dry before we paint over it. So we're going to go with the first layer, and you can pick 3 colors. I'm going to pick the primary color, so I'm going to do yellow. You want to make sure there is some water in there so it's not too dark. Then I'm going to do some of the cyan here. And then some of this red. All right. While these are drying, we're going to move on to the variegated wash. So variegated wash is very similar to a flat wash, except for we're going to be using 2 different colors. Okay, so when you're putting colors next to each other, you want to definitely go back and refer to your color wheel to see what they're going to do when they're next to each other, because again, if they're opposite the color wheel, you're going to neutralize those colors, and you tend to get brown, sometimes muddy color, sometimes a nice brown. So if that's what you want, that's great, but that's what you don't want, make sure you are aware of what the 2 colors are going to make, because they're going to be making that color when they meet in the middle. So I'm going to start this one with a little bit of a cyan. Probably could have made a square here first. Kind of got away with that. So I'm just like using my flat wash techniques, and then it's not cyan, that's magenta, and then I'm going to come over here, my blues. You have to work pretty fast because you don't want one color to dry. And I'm going to take this brush is not dry, but it's not completely wet. It's just in the middle. And then I'm just going to come back in here and I'm going to go back and forth to blend these two together. I'll wash this off. Taking my brush again, just kind of move this down. Well, the blue is pretty dark, so it's very dominant color for this, but it's okay. This is a great technique for your sunsets, maybe creating a little bit of value. All right, so you're going to get that nice, when it dries, it'll be a lot lighter, but that nice transition where they just kind of go into each other. There's not a hard edge in there. I'm just going to blend that a little bit more. All right. All right, so my glazing is dry. If your glazing is not dry, you can wait and go back and do this later if you had put too much water onto your colors, but mine's dry, so I'm going to go back and finish the second step to the glazing. So the cool thing I said about watercolor, it is translucent, so I could just go right back over this with another layer. And this is a wet on dry technique because one layer does need to be dry before the next one goes on. And you can see that you can see through it. Glazing is great for adding shadows, for adding depth to things when you're going back into them, for just adding atmospheric color to things, just all kinds of stuff you could do with glazing. And when people say you layer with watercolor, you can actually glaze one color, the same color over itself to make it a darker value. As you can see, this blue is a darker value with one more coat on it. So you can slowly build up your values when you're painting. All right, so there's a glazing technique. You can see this yellow has one extra layer. Then it's going over the blue, so it makes green. It's going over the red, so it makes orange. So it's really a great technique for adding color, layering, value, lots of stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next one, which is lifting. All right, for lifting, I'm going to put a square in here. Okay. And I'm also going to divide it because we're going to do two different lifting techniques. You can lift lots of different ways. So for one technique, I'm going to be using a sponge. You could use any kind of sponge you want to. You could even use a paper towel if you don't have a sponge. You could even use a cotton ball. So I'm just going to use this cheap sponge I have here, but if you don't have one, paper towel, toilet paper, I guess would work. And then the second one, I'm going to be using my brush for the technique. All right, so let's get some paint in the old mixing tray. All right, and I'm going to just do a nice flat wash in this area. I mean, you could do wet on wet. You don't have to do a wash. I just putting a wash here, just as long as it's nice and saturated so it doesn't dry too fast. And now I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to be lifting some of the paint off. See how that works? So you could do this for clouds. You could also lift if you make a mistake, like, oh no, there's a dot on the paper. Let me get my paper towel and lift it off. You can then wet it and then just lift it off till you can't see anymore. So if you do make a mistake, wet it, lift it, wet it, and then go in with a clean paper towel. Or if you have Mr. Clean erasers, they'll take the whole thing off as well. So the other one I'm going to show you how to do is with your brush. So I'm going to come in here again, do a nice wash. And this time I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to dry it off as dry as I can get it. And then I'm just going to lift with the brush. And this is a great technique if you accidentally get too much paint on something or you want to create highlights. So you can actually lift with the brush as well. So 2 different ways to lift off paint. Okay, so it's not taking it back to the original color of the paper. Again, if you really want to get super light, you can use a Mr. Clean eraser. All right, let's go ahead and go to negative painting. I love negative painting, and it's a great way to add depth to a painting and to add atmospheric color, lots of different things you can use for it. So here is that lifting and then negative painting. So I like to start with my lightest color first. So I'm going to start with this light green color here. I'm going to put just a very light layer of watercolor on there. Now that has to dry before you go to the next step. So you can blow dry it or wait. So we're just going to go to the last one while that's drying, and that is dry brushing. So dry brushing is also so again, wet on wet. I mean this is lifting. Negative painting is a wet on dry technique, and dry brushing is also a wet on dry technique. So dry brushing is something you would do at the very end, just like your detailing, your wet on dry. But instead of just painting with a very charged brush with lots of pigment and paint on there, or a little bit of pigment and paint, but with dry brushing, your brush is almost dry. And you really cannot do this with the watercolor. In your palette, it's too wet. You kind of have to find a happy medium in your palette to where something almost looks like you don't want to just grab a bunch of paint, but you're going to put the paint that's just moist on the tip of your brush. And I'm going to fan this out because I don't have a fan brush with me. You could just fan it out. And this technique is good for grass, it's good for fur, animals. You can create some nice technique with it. So I'm going to see if I can get some of this brown in here. This orange. So you can make pattern like textures with it. Now it's kind of wasteful when it comes to watercolor because it does take a lot of that paint, you know. So it's not, I mean, it's not something that I particularly like the way it treats my, I don't like what it does to my palette, but it's got its uses. So like you could add like the finishing touches on a tree or some bush in a landscape. So that's what dry brushing is. Eyelashes, if you're doing eyelashes, so it kind of has this really scratchy look to it. But it's a great technique for landscapes, animals, hair, lashes, anything with like that texture that you need. All right, so these are the traditional watercolor techniques. if you are making yours with me, you can pause this video as you go to create your traditional watercolor techniques. Oops, wait. I did not finish this negative painting one. Okay, let's finish that one. Good Lord. All right, so for this negative painting one, I have my first layer down. It is dry now. So now I'm going to draw some shapes on there. All right, so I'm just going to, instead of painting the area, I'm going to paint the area around the shapes, and that's why it's called a negative painting, because you're painting the negative space. And you could just really build up lots of depth if you just keep going in, drawing, painting the negative space. To add a little interest, I will add a little bit of red, a little wet there. All right, so you could even draw more spaces on that negative space and paint around that just to create that depth. So a lot of things you could do with negative painting. All right, so this is the traditional watercolor techniques. You can use in your watercolors painting.